When you stop waiting to feel ready, everything changes. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the psyche does not wait for our permission. It moves whether we feel prepared or not. And the waiting itself is often the last defense the ego builds against a life that is already calling. As Jung wrote in a letter collected in his Collected Works, Volume 8, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." And Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The very self you keep waiting to become ready enough to meet is already knocking, and the readiness you are waiting for is measured by a clock that stopped running years ago. You keep checking a morning gauge for an afternoon question, and no wonder it never reads full. No wonder the feeling of readiness never comes. It was never going to come from that gauge at all. So here is where I put myself in it. I say, I no longer wait for the feeling of readiness to arrive before I move. I let the moving itself become the proof I was looking for. I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. And if you felt something shift in your chest just now, some small door creak, that is not nothing. That is the psyche noticing it has been heard. And if this kind of teaching is doing something in you, consider subscribing so that tomorrow's reflection finds you the same quiet way this one did. Now, if any part of this is landing, if some old excuse just went a little transparent, type the words "face it" in the comments below. Just those 2 words. Let them be a small, honest marker that you saw it. The first key is this, that the feeling of readiness you are waiting for is not a psychological requirement. It is a leftover instrument, built for a program that already expired, and Jung named the shape of this plainly. He said we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, meaning the tools your 20s gave you, the caution that once protected a younger and less formed self, the checklist that once made sense. None of it was designed to measure a self that has already grown past it. So when you sit there this week, telling yourself you will begin the new work, the honest conversation, the changed life, the moment you finally feel ready, you are not being careful. You are consulting an instrument that cannot read your current hour at all. It is not caution. It is a program running in a season it no longer belongs to. And the ego loves this arrangement because waiting feels responsible. Waiting feels like wisdom. Waiting lets you keep the old persona a little longer without having to answer for the parts of you it was never built to hold. Notice how this gauge was calibrated. It was calibrated in a season when the stakes were smaller, when a wrong step could be undone easily, when there was so much time ahead that caution cost you almost nothing. And that calibration made sense then, but you kept the same gauge running for years past its season, the way a person keeps consulting an old map long after the roads have changed, trusting the paper over the ground beneath their own feet. Imagine an ordinary man at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening, 45 years old, turning over the same decision he has turned over for 3 years now, whether to leave the safe position for the work that actually calls him, and each Sunday he tells himself the same quiet sentence, "I will know when I am ready," and each Sunday nothing in him reads as ready, because the instrument he keeps checking was built when he was 26, built for a season when caution was survival, and it was never rebuilt for the man now sitting at that table. So the gauge stays silent forever, not because the calling is false, but because the gauge itself has nothing left to measure it with. Imagine a woman in her 40s who has told herself for a decade that she will leave the unfulfilling arrangement once she feels sure, once the fear quiets, once she is ready, and the fear does not quiet because fear was never the test. It is only the signal, not the verdict. And here is the plain reversal Jung would have you sit with. It is not that you are unready and therefore waiting. It is that the waiting itself has convinced you that unreadiness is a fact rather than a habit, a program still running quietly in the background long after its hour has passed. Hear this plainly. Readiness is not a feeling you wait for. It is a resonance you build by moving anyway. I stop consulting a gauge that was never built for now. The second key is this, that while you wait, the unlived life does not sit patiently in storage. It grows, it presses, it finds other doors. Jung taught that whatever we fail to live consciously does not disappear. It returns to us disguised, sometimes as restlessness that has no object, sometimes as an ache on a Sunday evening you cannot name, sometimes as irritability toward people who are simply living more openly than you allow yourself to live. This is the unlived life, knocking from the inside because you would not open the door from the outside. And here is the part that stings a little. The years you spend waiting to feel ready are not neutral years. They are not simply paused. They are years in which the unlived life accumulates interest, quietly, the way an unanswered letter grows heavier on a desk the longer it sits there, or the way a garden left untended does not simply stay as you left it. It does not wait politely for your attention. The weeds do not pause out of respect for your busy schedule. They climb, they tangle, they take root exactly where the good soil was softest, and one day you go looking for the path you meant to walk, and you cannot even find where it began. This is what waiting does to a life. It is never a still photograph. It is always a moving one. Think of an ordinary Tuesday. You wake. You tell yourself, today might be the day. By 10 you have found a reasonable delay. By 2 you have found another. By evening you tell yourself tomorrow, and this is not weakness exactly. It is the ego protecting its known shape against an unknown demand. But the demand does not go away for being postponed. It only grows a little more insistent, a little more disguised, until one day it appears not as a quiet ache, but as a full collapse. A marriage that suddenly feels unbearable. A career that suddenly feels like a costume. And the person standing in the wreckage asks, how did this happen so suddenly? And the honest answer is, it was never sudden. It was compounding the whole time you were waiting to feel ready. Imagine a man who tells himself for years he will start painting again once the children are older, once the mortgage is easier, once life feels less crowded. And the wanting does not wait politely for that clearing. It leaks sideways into a flatness at dinner, a short temper with people who paint freely, a low grief he cannot place on ordinary afternoons. And if you asked him what was wrong, he would not say, I am not painting. He would say something vague about being tired, being busy. And that vagueness is exactly the disguise Jung meant, the unlived life speaking through a language that hides its own source. Notice too how this works even in smaller households. A woman who keeps telling herself she will finally take her own work seriously once the house is calmer, once the season is easier, and instead of the calm arriving, she finds herself snapping at small things, feeling strangely wounded by other people's confidence, feeling a heaviness on ordinary mornings that has no obvious cause, and none of it is really about the house or the season. It is the unlived work, pressing quietly against a closed door. So consider this week where your own version of that ache shows up, not as a grand crisis, but as a small recurring weather, a mood that visits at the same hour, a jealousy that flares around the same kind of person, a tiredness that arrives exactly when a certain task is near, and ask plainly, what unlived thing in you might be knocking there? Because it is not asking to be understood, it is asking to be let in, and the longer the door stays shut, the less politely it knocks. I stop pretending that waiting is neutral. Waiting is compounding. The third key is this, and here Jung's own life is the plainest teacher he ever gave us, because in his late 30s, after the break with Freud, Jung did not feel ready for what came next. He felt, by his own account in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, disoriented, cut loose, at points frightened of what his own unconscious was showing him, and he did not wait for the fear to lift before he engaged it. He let himself, in his words, drop into the images that were rising in him, into what became the material of the Red Book, and years later, looking back on that very period, he said plainly that those were the most important years of his life, not the calm years, not the certain years, the frightened ones, the ones where he moved before he had any proof the moving would hold him. And this is worth sitting with slowly. The man who gave the modern world the very vocabulary of individuation did not begin his own individuation from a place of confidence. He began it from a place of near collapse, because he understood something most of us resist knowing, which is that coming to selfhood, what he called individuation, in his essay on the transcendent function collected in Collected Works Volume 7, paragraph 266, is not a reward given to the well-prepared, it is a demand made of the unprepared. That is the whole shape of it. Nobody arrives at 40 with a finished plan, a certified confidence, a feeling that says, begin now. Everyone who has ever done the deep turning work of the second half of life has done it while still afraid, while still uncertain, while the old persona was still half attached. So when you wait for the fear to clear before you take the honest conversation, the new direction, the overdue change, you are waiting for a condition that even Jung himself never had and did not need. Look closer at what he actually did in those months. He did not demand of himself a grand plan before he began. He simply sat with a blank page some evenings and let one image come, a single figure, a single scene, and he wrote it down exactly as it appeared. Without knowing yet what any of it meant, without any promise, it would resolve into a book, or a theory, or a life's work. He treated each evening as its own small act of trust, rather than proof of a larger readiness he did not have. And this matters because it shows readiness was never a single threshold he crossed once and then possessed forever. It was rebuilt, in small portions, night after night, by the sitting down itself. Imagine, for a moment, an ordinary person carrying the same demand in a smaller frame, a woman in her 30s who has felt for years the quiet pull to write, not for money, not for anyone else, just because something in her keeps circling back to the blank page like a tide that will not stop coming in, and she tells herself she will begin, once she feels like a real writer, once the sentences arrive with confidence, once the fear of being seen and misunderstood has settled, and none of that ever arrives on schedule. The fear does not politely wait its turn, it simply stays. The same way Jung's own fear stayed through the months he was recording the images that unsettled him most. And what changed for him was never the disappearance of the fear, it was the decision to keep moving inside it, one image at a time, one recorded dream at a time, without the reassurance that any of it would resolve into something respectable. And this is the model. Not comfort first, then action, but action carrying you toward a comfort that only arrives afterward, as its result, never as its precondition. Think of it this way. The readiness was not a door Jung found already open ahead of him. It was a door that only became visible once he had already stepped through the darker one beside it. And notice something else in her small story. The woman does not need a whole book finished to prove the pull was real. She only needs one honest paragraph written on an ordinary Tuesday evening, tired, unconvinced, still afraid of being misunderstood. And that one paragraph does something no amount of waiting could ever do. It turns the pull from an abstract ache into a lived fact, something that now exists in the world and can be added to. And this is exactly what Jung meant by coming to selfhood. Not a sudden transformation arriving whole, but a series of small, honest beginnings, each one made without the feeling he was supposedly waiting for. So ask yourself honestly, what is the smaller version of the red book sitting unopened in your own life right now? What page? What conversation? What direction have you been circling for years the way he circled those unsettling images, waiting for the fear to soften before you begin? When the truth, plainly, is that it will not soften first, it will only soften afterward. Once you are already inside the work, I do not wait to be fearless, I let the moving come first. The fourth key is this, and it is a warning as much as a teaching, because Jung described, in his essay on the stages of life, in Collected Works, Volume 8, the particular collapse of people who ran the morning program long past its season. Imagine a businessman, successful by every outer measure, who spent 30 years building an identity entirely around output, around being useful, being needed, being the strong one others leaned on, and who told himself the whole time that he would attend to the neglected parts of his own life once he was established enough, once he had earned the right to rest, once he finally felt ready to slow down and ask what the second half of his life might actually be for. And then retirement arrives, the calendar empties, the phone stops ringing with requests, and there is no crisis of income, no crisis of health, only a terrible quiet where a self was supposed to be, because he had spent every year of the waiting building competence for a program that had already run its course and had built nothing at all for the program that was now due. And here is the part worth sitting with a moment longer. He did not fail from laziness. He failed from a kind of misplaced thrift. He believed he was saving something up, storing readiness the way a man stores money, a little each year, until the account would finally be full enough to spend. But readiness is not that kind of currency. It cannot be banked in advance and drawn down later. Think of it instead like the warmth a room gains only once you light the fire in it. You cannot gather warmth ahead of time and carry it into a cold room later. The warmth exists only while the fire is burning. And it is the same with this feeling you keep postponing your life to wait for. It is produced by the friction of the actual living, not stored anywhere before that friction begins. So picture the ordinary version of this in a smaller life. Someone who tells themselves for years, "Once I feel more confident, I will speak up in the meeting. Once I feel more settled, I will have the honest conversation with my father. Once I feel ready, I will finally start the thing I keep circling." And every year that competence in the old role grows a little more polished, a little more admired, while the untouched task sits exactly where it was left, untouched, because sharpening a skill you already have is not the same as building the courage for the one you have avoided. This is the trap hidden inside waiting to feel ready. It lets you become extremely accomplished at yesterday's task while remaining a stranger to today's. The feeling of readiness you were saving yourself for never had anything to give you, because it was never stored anywhere. It does not exist ahead of time as a reserve you draw down when the moment comes. It is manufactured in the act of meeting the moment itself, so the man waits his whole working life for a feeling that could only ever have been produced by living the very thing he kept postponing. I do not save myself for a readiness that was never stored anywhere. The fifth key is the one I want to walk through slowly with you, because it is where the whole mechanism finally becomes visible at once. First, consider what waiting actually protects. It is not really protecting you from failure. Most people who wait are not actually afraid of trying and losing. They are afraid of the tension itself, the tension between the safe old shape and the unknown new demand. Jung called this the tension of opposites, and he taught, in his essay in Collected Works, Volume 13, that the greatest and most important problems of life can never be solved, but only outgrown, meaning you do not resolve the pull between the comfortable old self and the calling new one by finding the perfect argument that settles it once and for all. You outgrow the tension by living inside it long enough that a third thing quietly forms, something neither the old shape nor the new demand could have produced alone. What Jung elsewhere called the transcendent function, not a solution arriving from outside you, but a new attitude born from holding both sides without collapsing into either one. And here is the part almost everyone misses. That third thing, the actual felt sense of readiness you were waiting for, only ever arrives after you have already begun moving, never before. It is not the starting gun. It is something more like a compass needle that only settles once the ship is already underway. So if you insist on waiting for the needle to settle before you leave the harbor, you will wait forever, because a compass needle on a stationary ship simply spins. It has nothing to read against. It needs the motion first. Second, consider the shape of an ordinary day spent waiting, because this is where it stops being abstract and becomes something you can recognize from your own week. You wake, and there is a small, honest impulse, maybe to write the email, to start the application, to say the true thing to the person across the table, and instead of moving on it while it is warm, you tell yourself, "Not yet. Let me feel a little more sure first." By 9, that impulse has gone quiet. By noon, you have replaced it with busyness that feels productive but changes nothing. You answer messages. You tidy the desk. You tell yourself, this counts as movement. By 3, you have told yourself a story about timing. that it is not the right season, that next month will be clearer, that a sign will come. By 6, you are tired in the particular way that comes not from effort, but from the effort of avoiding effort. And you go to sleep having spent an entire day managing the feeling instead of answering the demand. And this is not a single day's failure. It is the exact architecture of years. The same pattern repeated with different disguises, a different excuse each morning wearing the same face, until a decade has gone by, built entirely from postponements that each felt, in the moment, completely reasonable. And here is the quiet cruelty of it. No single day of waiting ever feels like the day that ruins everything. It is only ever the sum of them that does. Third, consider what Jung actually asked of his patients in the second half of life. In Collected Works, Volume 11, he wrote plainly that among all his patients past the midpoint of life, the ones who came to him with a sense of meaninglessness were not people who lacked ideas. They were people who had stopped answering the demand their own depths were already making of them. And what he asked of them was never to feel ready first. It was to take one honest look at what the unconscious was already saying, through dreams, through symptoms, through the restless unnamed ache, and to act from that look before certainty arrived, because certainty was never going to arrive first. Imagine a man who comes to such a reckoning at 50, who has spent 30 years telling himself he will attend to the neglected corners of his life, once the mortgage is settled, once the children are grown, once one more promotion has landed, and who discovers, when he finally sits still long enough to listen, that the ache was never about timing at all. It was the unlived life asking to be let in. And the asking does not wait politely for a convenient decade. Fourth, consider what the tension actually feels like in the body, because it is rarely dramatic. It is not usually panic. It is more often a low, steady discomfort, a tightness that shows up as procrastination, as sudden tiredness the moment you sit down to begin, as an unexplained irritability toward the very thing you claim to want. This is not weakness, and it is not a sign you are unready. It is the felt pressure of two claims on you at once, the claim of the familiar shape and the claim of the unlived one. And the mistake is thinking this pressure must vanish before you can act. It does not vanish before you act. It eases only once you have begun carrying both claims at the same time, which is the only way a third thing is ever born. Fifth, imagine a woman who has taught piano for 20 years in the same small studio, competent, respected, tired in a way she cannot quite name, and for most of that time, some quieter voice in her has wanted to compose her own music instead of only teaching other people's, and she tells herself she will begin once she feels she has earned the right. Once a student compliments her enough, once the fear of writing something clumsy and untrained finally goes quiet, and it does not go quiet, because it was never meant to go quiet first. One evening, tired of the waiting itself, more than tired of the fear, she sits at the piano after the last student has left and plays 4 uncertain bars that belong to no one else, badly, honestly, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 20 years loosens by exactly that much, not because the 4 bars were good, but because she had finally let the tension move through her hands instead of holding it in her chest. This is the third thing Jung meant. It was not given to her in advance. It was produced in the act, and it could only ever have been produced there. Sixth, notice that the tension does not resolve into comfort. It resolves into capacity. You do not wake up one day with the fear gone. You wake up one day slightly more able to carry it while you work. And that capacity is the only readiness that was ever actually available to you. Everything else you were waiting for was a fantasy of certainty that no living person, including Jung himself, was ever granted before beginning the exercise. I want to leave you with this week. Sit for a few honest minutes and ask yourself plainly, what old instruction are you still obeying that was written for a much younger, much less complete version of you? What caution made sense once and has simply never been reviewed since? Write down one place where you are waiting to feel ready, and then ask the harder question. What would it look like to take the smallest true step today? Not the leap, just the step, before the feeling arrives, because the feeling was never going to be the cause of the step. It was always going to be the consequence of it. And once you have taken that one small step, notice, really notice, the small shift that follows. Not triumph, just a slightly steadier footing. That steadier footing is the beginning of the very readiness you thought you had to wait for. It was manufactured by the walking, not delivered in advance of it. Do this once, and it feels like luck. Do it for a week, and it starts to feel like a pattern you can trust. Do it for a season, and you will hardly recognize the person who used to sit so still at that kitchen table, waiting for a feeling that was never coming on its own. I stop waiting for the compass to settle before I leave the harbor. The sixth key is the quiet one, the one that stays with you after the others have done their work. Jung wrote that the neglected, unlived elements of a life do not vanish. They wait, and they carry, in his words, a significance of their own. And I want you to hear that gently, because it means nothing in you has been wasted by the waiting. The unlived parts of your life are not lost. They are simply still waiting to be given their weight, their day, their meaning. And that day does not require you to feel ready. It only requires you to take the next small step while the feeling is still absent. The lantern in the old image never lights the whole road at once. It only ever lights the next few feet. And that has always been enough for every person who has ever actually walked anywhere. You do not need the full light of readiness to take one true step. You only need the willingness to walk while the road ahead stays dark a little longer. Think for a moment of an ordinary evening. A man sits at his kitchen table with a letter he has meant to write for years, an apology, or a request, or simply an honest word to someone he has quietly drifted from. And he tells himself, once I know exactly what to say, once I feel the calm certainty that this is right, then I will write it. And so the letter waits, not because the words are missing, but because the feeling he is holding out for keeps failing to arrive. And one night, tired of waiting, he simply picks up the pen and writes one uncertain sentence, not the whole letter, only the first honest line, and something small happens. The sentence, once written, makes the next sentence possible. The lantern he was carrying only lit that first line, and yet that was enough to see the second. And consider too an older woman who kept a piano untouched in the corner of her front room for 11 years, telling herself she would play again once her hands remembered how, once the old confidence returned, once she felt again like the girl who once played without thinking. And the confidence never returned by sitting quietly in the corner, waiting to be summoned. It returned only the evening she finally sat down and played one clumsy scale, badly, half-remembered, and found that the next scale came slightly easier, not because the readiness had been hiding in the piano bench all along, but because it was made fresh in the very playing she had postponed. This is the whole secret hiding inside the waiting. The light was never going to arrive all at once. It was only ever going to arrive one step ahead of the step you were already taking, one scale ahead of the scale you were already playing, one sentence ahead of the sentence you were already writing. So hear this plainly. The unlived life is not a debt collected all at once. It is paid the way a lantern is carried, a few feet at a time, in the dark, by someone willing to walk before the whole road is visible. And every hour you spend demanding the full light before you move is an hour spent standing still, in a darkness that only ever needed one lit step to begin dissolving. The letter did not need the whole speech to begin healing something. The piano did not need the whole concert to begin remembering itself. And neither does your own postponed life need the whole plan before its first honest note is struck. I let the next step be lit and trust the rest to follow. Here is the whole picture. The feeling of readiness you keep waiting for is a morning instrument being asked to read an afternoon question. The unlived life does not pause while you wait. It compounds. Even Jung himself began his deepest turning without confidence, only willingness. The ones who wait too long at the height of their competence often meet the emptiest silence at the end of it. The tension between old shape and new demand is not solved but outgrown, one small step at a time, before the feeling ever arrives. And nothing unlived in you is wasted, it only waits for its hour. And all of these were never 6 separate teachings. They were one single turning of the same key, seen from 6 different angles. the turning that says, "The readiness is built by the walking, never handed to you before a tea." I no longer wait for the feeling of readiness to arrive before I move. I let the moving itself become the proof I was looking for. I make the unconscious conscious, and once more, quietly, I make the unconscious conscious. And if you are still standing at that doorway tonight, still waiting for the feeling to arrive before you cross it, ask yourself gently, what if the feeling was never going to come first? What if it was only ever going to come after you had already begun?